So hello everybody, I hope you are all well. My name is Volkmar Helmich. I'm the president of the Cornell Club of Germany. I want to give you and provide you with a warm welcome here. I'm sitting in Frankfurt. Weather today is not so nice over here, a little bit of showers, but really would like to extend the welcome to the Cornell alums that dialed in today, the friends and all the other participants that were able to make it. We have about close to 70 registered participants, and we're quite honored to have Lukas today here. But before we go into his presentation, we'd like to give you a brief overview update where we stand with the Cornell Club of Germany. I mean, we have been founded in 1991. And I see Wolfgang here, also Wolfgang Fritzemeyer, sitting, I guess, in Munich, or maybe in Austria, waving his hand. Together with other members, he founded the club back then. Also, the current board members, Lois Konrad, Hans-Günther Thonemann, and Heike Dengler are also today here with you. And also a warm welcome on behalf of all of those to all of you. Normally, we would have met today in Nuremberg, which is sort of our regular event. Not to say that we always meet in Nuremberg, we always meet in another city every year. We already had to postpone it the second time now, unfortunately, last year and this year. And we're trying now, or hoping for a meeting in early October. So for the Cornellians and the Cornell alums among you, please mark your calendar 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of October. And hopefully, I mean, we're strongly hoping that we can meet back then in Nuremberg. Also, brief update for those of you who are sort of non-Cornellians or non-Germans. The way we organized is that we have local chapters here in Germany. So our main chapters are Berlin, Rhein-Ruhr, which is the western part, then Rhein-Main, Frankfurt, that's where I'm sitting, and Munich. Those are the four main points. Since Germany is not so we have different major cities, that's the way we're organized. And this is obviously, or not obviously, our first sort of talk and webinar. And we're really quite excited and honored to sort of organize it today. And really already thanked and do that again here to the Cornell Alumni Office, Diego, Hongman, and also Erica. I mean, many thanks for your support here. It's highly appreciated. Maybe one word on the logistics before we go into the presentation. So Lukas is going to present about 45 minutes on his topic, Post-COVID Look at Smart Cities and Smart Mobility. Then we'll have a Q&A session. Is scheduled for 15 to 20 minutes, but we are quite flexible. We already have a lot of questions posted, and I think you're more than happy to raise hands or post questions into the chat so that we then have lively discussions, ideally right after his presentation. And then we'd like to invite you to a social mixer so that we have, depending on the participant or the number of participants, we have different breakout rooms, we'll say 6 to 9 people, then for maybe 10 to 15 minutes each. But that is really quite flexible at the end. I would like to end today at 7 p.m. sharp. So with that, I'd like to extend again a warm welcome to Lukas. Lukas Neckermann is a Cornell alum of the class of '96. And we're really honored that he is sort of willing to give his first speech and the first presentation to all of us, and I let him introduce himself. Lukas, the floor is yours.
Volkmar, you said that you were honored. It's quite the opposite, actually. It is my distinct honor to present to the Cornell Club of Germany. I've given probably over 150 keynote speeches over the course of the last 5, 6, 7 years. And it's safe to say I've not given any to a better educated audience than this one. I'm really, really thrilled to be amongst fellow Cornellians. I'm, as Volkmar said, a arts grad from 1996, studied science and technology studies. And funnily enough, a lot of that actually comes into what I do today. Now, although I appreciate the Cornellians amongst you will be a very critical, but also a very open audience. I also appreciate that there are a lot of Germans in the audience. I'm coming to you today from London, but there are a lot of Germans, and I know very well that there is sometimes a bit of a resistance to my thesis. Germany, and perhaps Italy, is unique in its love and its passion for the privately owned vehicle. And like so many other Germans, I too was socialized to see the car as freedom. But it's safe to say that certainly since living in London, today I really embrace car freedom. And that itself is part of my story for you today. Because how free are we really? How free are we really with those 2 tons of steel around us? Driving at 10 miles an hour in a traffic jam, in a city, or even on a highway, on an autobahn. And how free has that made us as a society? The old song goes, they paved paradise and put up a parking lot. And well, quite certainly, when we look at our cities today, that's the case. But it's much more than us favoring parking lots over parks. It's the way we get around. And hey, I still remember growing up in upstate New York and actually taking a yellow school bus to school. But take a look at this scene. Take a look at this scene. These are cars lined up, dropping off kids at a school. And they're, if you see to the right, top right of the screen, actually, you can see them lining up down the street. Rows of 2 dropping off their kids. Now think of the time. Think of the energy. Think of the space investment that goes into this. Have we misaligned our priorities? Have we built playgrounds for cars rather than for kids? And we can see it even in the way we build our houses, right? Take a look at this average American house. 2/3 of it is for cars, and 1/3 is for living. Now, in the German context, you might say, well, it's very, very different. And of course, that's not the case. And actually, we have about 1/3 of our infrastructure in most German cities dedicated to traffic, to transport. Now, that means we're not quite as extreme as, say, Los Angeles, where the land dedicated to parking is larger than the island of Manhattan. And in fact, if you took all of the vertical parking facilities in Los Angeles and you spread it out and you put the parking spots side by side, you would be covering the entire area of central Los Angeles. In fact, we have more parking lots, 2 to 3 times more parking spots in the US than we have people. And that holds true in parts of Europe anyway, as well. Why? Well, because you need one where you're coming from, and you need one where you're going, and probably also at the store that you're going to, or as we saw, the school where you're dropping off your kids. And when things get crowded, when things get really busy on the streets, we lose time and more importantly, we lose money to congestion, traffic jams. But we think we can solve that problem We think we can solve that problem by just adding one more lane. And that, fellow Cornellians, is a fallacy. That's simply not true. Sisyphus and the tragedy of induced demand. Induced demand says that as we build more traffic infrastructure, we in fact make the problem worse. We create more congestion. And this little cartoon on the left-hand side basically says it all. The proposed freeway to remove the bottleneck created by the previous proposed freeway to remove the bottleneck created by the previous highway that we expanded by 2 lanes, 3 lanes, 4 lanes, 5 lanes in order to fix the bottleneck. We need to break that cycle because that cycle has caused us great damage. I'll talk about that shortly. Let me give you an example from a city very, very close to Ithaca that we might all be familiar with. Just an hour away from Cornell is the city of Syracuse. Now, many of you will remember how you got to Cornell. You probably took the thruway, and then you took the I-81, and you might have actually passed right over what used to be central Syracuse. Highway was built through the center of a town, basically not bifurcating, trifurcating the inner city. And what that did, it meant that city was decimated. Syracuse thought that by building a giant highway in the middle of town, it could become an economic powerhouse. Instead, it got what was described by the Atlantic, the worst slum problem in America. Perhaps that's an overstatement, perhaps not. The point is that the highway, it decimated what was a vibrant inner city. And we see this all over the US, but we also see it in Europe as well. Urban highways that have destroyed cities. But it's not just the vibrancy of our inner cities that are being decimated. It's much, much worse than that. It's the families that are impacted by the fatalities. Now, in the year 2020, German traffic accidents led to 330,000 injuries and just over 2,700 fatalities. To put that in a broader context, our global fatality rate is 3,300 per day due to traffic. Now, we did say that this was a post-COVID look, didn't we? So you might argue, well, we weren't all driving around during COVID. It must be a lot better. Well, yes and no. It's actually a mixed picture. The EU had the world's safest roads in 2020, primarily because people weren't traveling. But the US had the worst traffic death rate in nearly a century, basically since the advent of cars in the year 2020. Wide open roads meant that people were speeding, no doubt, also staring at their smartphones, because these fatalities, the 40,000 deaths on US roads in 2020 and the 2,700 on German roads in 2020 can, by and large, over 90% be attributed to driver error. Gets so far that our good friend Elon Musk says, hey, people may actually outlaw driving cars because it's simply too dangerous. In fact, you can't have a person driving around a 2-ton death machine. So what's the solution? Well, we can remove the driver or we can remove the car. But it's not just the road fatalities that we need to be aware of. It's also the air quality issues that are a result of our way of life. This map here, which was the status yesterday on world air quality, every time you see a red box, a deep red box, or even a purple box, those are areas of the world, in this case in China and India and Southeast Asia, where the air quality is so bad that anybody anybody certainly with any respiratory issues should stay inside, but others are also not advised to go outside and do any sports. Now, you might say, well, it's not that bad in Germany or France or Italy or in Europe, is it? Well, we'll get to that. Air pollution kills an estimated 7 million people worldwide every year. And the air pollution that we create, somewhere around 35%. It depends, of course, if we're talking about particulate matter, NOx or CO2. It varies slightly between roughly 25 and 40%. But broadly speaking, the air pollution that we have can be attributed to 35% from transport. So what's the picture in Europe? Well, we do see some red boxes. And in fact, there would be quite a few more if we didn't have lockdowns as we do now. And I think anyone who's dialing in today from, for example, Stuttgart might be very familiar with this. Der Kessel, right? Where the air quality, the air pollution is collected in the valleys. And other cities as well. Paris, deeply impacted in Europe. In fact, in many Eastern European cities in particular, air quality was a number 1, number 2, or number 3 concern of the residents of those cities. And that's ahead of things like healthcare, education, policing, infrastructure, and jobs. Air quality as a top 3 concern in major cities across Europe, because in fact, air pollution kills 400,000 Europeans every year. Now, again, post lockdown or in a lockdown world, can we be happy that the air quality is maybe a little bit better? Yeah, maybe. Okay, so it's 11,000 fewer according to one study. Now, it's Saturday night. I don't want to be too much of a downer. I will get to the more upbeat part of this speech and join me for the ride. But I did want to say that, listen, that personal car that we've come to love and misperceive as a synonym for freedom lies at the root of many of our ills. It's healthcare costs. It's the CO2 emissions, and it's the fatalities from road accidents. Now we have a problem, in particular in Germany, but perhaps even across most of Europe. We've built entire industries around the car, so we can't just snap our fingers and poof, away it goes, can we? Well, we probably also shouldn't. Tires and insurance, motorsports, filling stations, lots of industries that we've built around the private vehicle. And in fact, in Germany, it's a particular problem. Somewhere around 5% of our GDP, in fact, 20% of the industry revenue is linked to the automotive industries. Directly employing 800,000 employees and indirectly somewhere around 1 or 2 million people. So we can't destroy that, can we? And we've been accused of hunting and killing our own industry, haven't we? Selbstzerstörung statt Freude am Fahren, eine Treibjagd auf die eigene Autoindustrie. The headlines screaming out that this eco-consciousness, this Greta Thunbergism, is going to destroy our industry. That's simply and utterly wrong. Non-action will destroy our industries, because the reality is that the internal combustion engine on which so much of the German industry has been built, is already dead. It's being replaced fully by that thing that you see in the center of the screen, that electric motor and the battery that is linked to it. And the good news is, of course, that our German industry recognized it already. VW, Audi, Daimler, even Ford of Germany, all have announced an end to the development and ultimately also the production of internal combustion engines. And that's, frankly, that can't come soon enough, not for economic reasons, but because it is sapping our engineering resources into a dead-end street. Can't we take this opportunity to build new industries and be a leader in the new industry? We can only do that if we make a firm commitment to full electrification, as other countries and frankly other industries already have. Our neighbors, Netherlands, are doing it not just with cars, but even all of their buses. 246 buses in the Netherlands might not sound like a lot, and frankly, it isn't a lot if you compare it to cities in China with 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 fully electric buses. So where do we stand? Are we ready? Are we there? I would suggest we are, in fact, already there. Perhaps surprisingly, the share of passenger car sales in the EU, the first quarter of 2021, was almost a third electrified. That means hybrid, plug-in hybrid, and fully electric vehicles. And the petrol or gasoline and diesel engines that we've so come to love or hate have dropped precipitously, and with it as well their residual values. Anyone who's in leasing or financing, I'm sorry, but you won't be getting a lot for those diesel and petrol vehicles once we get over the pandemic bump of used vehicle residual values. And that's because progressively more and more electrified vehicles will hit the streets. Okay, so that's the zero emissions part of the equation. The other part of the equation is zero accidents. And I won't talk too much about electric cars because what the pandemic has shown us, autonomous cars, what the pandemic has shown us is other use cases for autonomy, such as robots that clean things, robots that police areas, robots even that deliver goods to people who are self-isolating. And in fact, one company that I'll highlight now is one called Starship. I'll let this video play. It's quite fascinating because they've in fact delivered over 1 million packages.
People believe that robots could deliver things, but they think this is going to be far into the future. But this is actually today. At Starship, we like to solve big problems. We wanted to build a robot that could autonomously drive on the sidewalk and deliver packages, food and groceries to people's doorsteps. I needed a very talented team, so I hired all the best engineers that I could find. It required a lot of experimentation, exploring something that had never been done in the world before.
Success story, by the way.
We were the first to really deploy robots in public spaces. Our robots are doing thousands of deliveries around the world every day and are doing as many miles as the leading autonomous driving companies, especially now.
As many miles as Waymo, Cruise and others are doing.
Contactless deliveries. And people love our service.
But delivering goods. In fact, here in the UK.
We just completed our millionth delivery.
Hello, here's your delivery.
I love how he just said hello.
So here in the UK, we have grocery stores in Milton Keynes and also coffee shops even delivering goods by these robots. So you can see that the pandemic has given rise not just to electrification and more electrified vehicles, but also autonomy, but in a different context than we thought might be coming. It's much more about logistics. So let's go back to these theses that we've kind of put into also the invitation for today. And this is Maria Barra, the CEO of General Motors, and she tweeted somewhere around 2017, 2018, zero crashes, zero emissions, zero congestion. This is the GM vision to move humanity forward. I have to say I was rather flattered when she tweeted that, because my book that said zero emissions, zero accidents, zero ownership came out in 2015. They wouldn't pay me any royalties on that, but I had a great chat with the PR department at GM anyway. And the commitment that not just GM, but Ford and Daimler and others have made extends indeed to autonomous and electrification. What it doesn't extend towards, and what most have an issue with, is zero ownership. And I'll talk a little bit about that now, because the most powerful mobility instrument that we now have at our disposal is no longer that steering wheel that we all know. No, that powerful mobility instrument is what you have in your front pocket, your back pocket, your vest pocket, whatever you have. It gives you many, many more options. It gives you the option to take public transport. It gives you the option to car share, bike share, scooter share, ride hail, ride pool, and many, many other modes. And the more we can integrate those modes, the more it simplifies the process of transitioning towards a car-free, certainly urban area. And there are companies that are doing exactly that. Here's an example. The company Trafi, who has an app in Munich, but also in Berlin. The app is called GLG. And what it allows you to do, it lets you take, as I said, public transport, car sharing, pooled rides, kick scooters, bikes and scooters, and pay for them directly within the app. There are even other apps, such as Whim in Helsinki, which allow you to have a subscription. So you pay 300 or 400 euros a month, the way you would today pay for a lease on a car. But with that, you get all of these modes included, fully included in your subscription, because of course, subscription, like Netflix, just like Netflix, just with your wheels. And in a time of Corona, when we are not entirely sure where and when we can go, where we can drive, what streets have been turned into bike lanes, or what streets have perhaps been turned into quiet streets, it's nice to have that comfort from an app that will give you those alerts while you're traveling around. Now, this next part is clearly a plug for a company for whom I'm COO, and that's Split, because the key question is, how do we get more people to use apps such as this one? And at Split anyway, we say, well, why don't we just put mobility into those apps that people are already using, such as here. Booking.com is an app that that you might be using for hotels or for rental cars. If you could actually just hail a ride and pay for a ride directly in the platform, why wouldn't you? Or a better example, in China, there's Alipay. Alipay is used by over 1 billion people, and directly on the front page, the home page of the Alipay app, you will see a button for rides. And you can, just as you might order something from Alipay or order food or pay for goods, you can order a ride or reserve a scooter and pay for a scooter directly out of the Alipay app. So the Split approach is actually to build mobility and access to mobility into those apps that we already use, and those apps being called super apps. All right. And it does so in 2,000 cities all over the world with 2 billion users, with a vast assortment of different providers that are already baked into that platform. Now, when we have this freedom, this newfound freedom that is access to mobility as opposed to the confines of car ownership, does this mean that it's the end of an era for our auto industries. Let's separate our auto industry from a new industry that is emerging. We believe that mobility is a new industry in its own right, and it is completely different from the auto industry in two key ways. On the one hand, you've got manufacturing. On the other hand, you've got operations. On the other axis, you've got shared versus ownership. Our auto industry has an objective to sell you metal and wheels. They build and they sell. The mobility industry doesn't care about building, and it doesn't care about selling. It cares about operating and sharing. And this fundamental difference between automotive and mobility is the reason why Daimler, BMW, Ford, GM all exited the sharing model. Sharing is not compatible with the core business model of our OEMs. They not only lack the skills, but also the money. Daimler and BMW together invested €1 billion to make car sharing and ride hailing fly. Now, do we think that's a lot or a little? It sounds like a lot, but in reality, it's petty cash in comparison to the 90 billion market value of an Uber or a Lyft or a Didi or a Grab, who are all with a market cap that are higher than most current OEMs. So to say that our OEMs are underfunded to fight the battle of mobility would be an understatement. The automotive value chain, as I said, sells metal and wheels. This is what we've all come to know in the industry. You've got your first tier suppliers, you've got your manufacturer, you've got a dealership, and perhaps there's a fleet manager as well. But there's a certain amount of distance between the car manufacturer and the end user. The industry that we're talking about is built up in a completely different way. Yes, you have suppliers, but the suppliers that we're talking about are people like Google and NVIDIA. Yes, you have manufacturers, but those manufacturers are not necessarily BMW and Daimler. Those manufacturers could be Foxconn. The same people who built your iPhone will be building cars. We have systems and data. We have fleet management. But as I've said, there are mobility operators, extremely well-funded mobility operators and aggregators that are bringing together alternatives towards car ownership. This new value chain has a value. We've done a bottom-up analysis of somewhere around 800-900 billion by 2030. And because we are, of course, in a German, or let's say a DACH audience here, how many companies have we identified? Around 137 in various parts of this value chain. The bulk of them are surprisingly not in the manufacturing part, simply because the manufacturer, yes, is big, but there just aren't that many of them. But in the Mittelstand, who does actually supply quite well into even the new manufacturing, and also in systems and data, in particular in Germany. That's where we find them. If you want to see more and know more and learn about these 900 different companies that we've identified in our database, just feel free to reach out. We've clustered them, we've grouped them into buckets as per the value chain. But so much for 4 wheels. What about 2 wheels? Micro-mobility. I'm sure many of you have seen scooters and bikes much, much more. Perhaps you've used scooters and bikes much, much more, even as an alternative to public transport during the pandemic. They've kept the economies moving, and they will continue to do so because there's enormous investment going into. In fact, over half of bikes sold in Europe now are e-bikes, and a lot of those are in fact going into shared business models. Here's a picture from Münster. I had the pleasure of spending 2 years in Münster, and of course, a bike capital, perhaps arguably a bike capital in Germany. But yeah, what you see here is infrastructure being built around bikes and scooters. And when we talk about infrastructure being built, nobody can hold a candle to our friends, once again, next door in the Netherlands, where you have this infrastructure here, that roundabout that you see above the street. Yes, that's a bicycle roundabout. And as so many of you have opted to socially distance on 2 wheels during the pandemic, European cities have embraced that by putting up temporary, but now also permanent new bike lanes, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of new bike paths, which will form part of the post-COVID recovery plan. Let's say that they've taken the unique opportunity that the pandemic has presented us with to bring forth reallocation plans. And I say reallocation plans because remember how I said those 30% or so of urban areas that are dedicated to transport? That's by and large right now for cars, maybe buses. Now, a lot of that is now being reallocated. And I'll share more on how in just a moment. Let's take a look at a couple more pictures. This is what Paris used to look like, right? Now, not so much recently, but there were plenty of days where Paris will have shut down that path and made it a pedestrian zone only. Now, Paris has now said that they're going to do that not only for 1 day a week or 1 day a month. No, Paris wants to do it in its city center completely by next year. That is a very substantial change. And the logic behind is, of course, greenification, yes, but also safety. And frankly, also quality of life. There's a principle that sits behind it. If you want to dig into that a little bit more, it's called the 15-minute city, the idea that you should be able to reach all of the things that you want to reach, such as education, such as healthcare, such as socialization, restaurants, theaters, what have you, and of course your workplace, if you still choose to go there, within 15 minutes. Not all cities are being quite so bold, but many cities are doing simpler things just to clear the air a little bit. I mentioned Stuttgart before, but London, where I am, if you want to drive into London, and if you happen to have an older diesel vehicle, well, I'm really sorry, it will cost you somewhere around 25 to 30 euros a day to do so. So it's not an outright prohibition, but the economic disincentive is quite substantial. So yes, change is in the air. I said before they paved paradise and put up a parking lot. Well, we're doing the opposite now. They're paving streets and putting up quality of life, pedestrian and living areas. The city of Copenhagen, which is very, very well known for its bicycle infrastructure, wasn't always that way. It wasn't born as a city of bicyclists. It got there by making a concerted effort. Former mayor of Copenhagen said, by reducing the car lanes, we reduced traffic by 57%, but increased mobility by 20%. How do you do that? Quite simple. A bike doesn't take as much space as a car, but it transports exactly the same one person. Now, let's go back to Syracuse and the I-81, that project that destroyed the inner city of Syracuse. Well, the current recommendation is that the I-81 highway is actually removed once again. Great news. coming to Syracuse, just as has been done in many other cities all around the world. Seoul, Mexico City, Bogota, Paris, that have taken urban highways and replaced them. So what does your post-pandemic city look like? Can we reduce the car lanes? Maybe put in more bike lanes, a bus lane? Maybe we need to put in a robot route for deliveries so that you can get your groceries. Maybe we actually will have so many electric scooters that we'll need to put in some dedicated lanes for those electric scooters as well. And maybe we won't even need, as in this picture, to have that car driving around our city anymore. Maybe it's also not a bus. Maybe it's a series of autonomous shuttles that are daisy chained, as my friends at Next Future Transportation do. What we can be sure of is that our city tomorrow will look very, very different from our city today. Thank you. Over to you. I'm curious on your questions and thoughts and ideas, fellow Cornellians.
Hans Gelke here. You didn't speak about ambulances, garbage, and other logistic services that have to go into the city. Where will they be driving?
So for those cities that are in fact pedestrianizing, they do allow for ambulances and services. There are some very progressive cities that have, for example, the waste removal through underground pipes, believe it or not, where the waste is actually brought into central areas. That's quite a substantial infrastructure commitment and also cost related to that. But yeah, there are solutions. If you actually look to Barcelona, they have implemented what are called super blocks. These are areas where the resident who may still have a car is able to actually drive the car at 5 km/h into his or her residential area. But in the same way, also deliveries, ambulances, fire departments, and those things can have access, but the access is severely restricted.
Lukas, here we had, can you hear me well?
Yes, I can. I can see the questions coming into the chat as well.
Yeah, if you take the question from the chat, or I give you one that came up a couple of times from people that registered, and which is if you could, I mean, you mentioned OEMs and big computer companies in your one chart, at least automotive focus versus sort of mobility company focus. I do remember that one. Can you elaborate on your view or on your research and forecast? I mean, especially with a view to the German. I mean, do we see Daimler and BMW in the next century or in the next 30, 40 years, or is it all Google, Amazon, and what have you?
I think the key message around the value chain was that there are that there's a coming and much greater specialization, a specialization within those elements. There's not any one company that can own the mobility value chain. Not a Google, not an Uber, not a Daimler, not a BMW. Nobody can own the entire value chain from tech until production, right through to ownership. They don't do it today. Why would they do it in a mobility value chain? So the key question for our manufacturers is what is their strength? What is their core strength? They have two things from what I can see is they have fantastic design and development and production of vehicles. And the other strength might be that they have a brand. But the brand is fungible. The brand can disappear quite quickly because, to be honest, if you're no longer buying a vehicle, the brand that you want is the one that is going to get you from A to B. So we'll leave that aside. What they're left with is, of course, the ability to develop and produce. Now, Germany not being a low-cost labor country. The question is, how will Germany differentiate itself? And is there even space for a differentiated physical product in a on-demand mobility world? I think there may be. I think there may be. Today, maybe we don't care when you call an Uber whether you're sitting in a Toyota Prius or a Mercedes E-Class. But tomorrow, those vehicles may be more differentiated, not by brand, but just by who delivers to whom. So Uber has placed an order with a UK-based electric vehicle company called Arrival. And Arrival is going to build dedicated ride-hailing vehicles for Uber. And I can imagine that similar scenarios will be in India. Maybe Ola will ask Tata to build dedicated vehicles. And Didi certainly already has asked manufacturers to build dedicated vehicles. So the differentiator is not so much in the brand, but the differentiator can be who has the B2B relationship with the mobility operator who has the brand in the end.
Well, maybe one more question, and I'll try to open it up to other questions in the chat here. There were questions here from Hans Kialka and Wolfram Birkmeier talking about urban air mobility, or the third or fifth dimension. I remember that one film with this one actor, but maybe the Fifth Element, I think it was. So do you have a view on that one? I mean, in Germany, we have these startup companies called Volocopter, Lilium, and others, a lot of noise, and people speculate whether that's any, is there a future for something like that? Can you have a view on that?
Indeed, Germany does have a leading position with Volocopter and Lilium, two very promising and interesting companies that build basically passenger drones, if you will. For me, the term urban air mobility is a bit of a misnomer, because their primary purpose will not be to take you from one urban space to another urban space, but it should really be more a suburban and rural mobility space, because quite frankly, there won't be a lot of places where you can land those urban air vehicles, as it were, in most European cities. Now, there may be some exceptions. For example, if we look to the Middle East, where there are new cities being developed, and maybe those cities will have skyports for passenger drones built right from the ground up. But that's a few years to go before they can build for skyports in Dubai. So my thought is that Lilium and Volocopter will focus a little bit more on that trip from, let's say, the Allianz Arena to someone's home in the outskirts of Landshut, or maybe from the Frankfurt airport to somewhere in Taunus.
Okay, understood. Thanks. Maybe some question from the audience, if you want to raise your hand, and then I think we can unmute you and give you the audience. Anybody with or maybe Hans Günther? I've seen you had a question in the chat.
Well, I think there's a very interesting question posed by Hans Günther in the chat. Perhaps if Lukas could focus on that. Thank you.
Ich kann das mal kurz elaborieren. Lukas, der Hintergrund meiner Frage kam aufgrund eines Vortrags von Dennis Meadows, der dir vielleicht ein Begriff ist. Der hat 1972 das berühmte Buch geschrieben, Die Grenzen des Wachstums. Und darüber hast du ja heute ein bisschen was erzählt. Und eine seiner Kernaussagen dreht sich um die Frage, was ist eigentlich wichtiger, Technologie oder Verhalten? Deswegen war jetzt meine Frage an dich gerichtet, von deinem Standpunkt aus, so wie du das vorgetragen hast, hast du ja eigentlich gesagt, Technologie ist weniger der maximale Treiber für Luftqualität und weniger Unfälle, als vielmehr die Änderung von Verhalten und dann im Sinne von Ursache und Wirkung, die Auswirkungen auf Mobilität und dann erst die Nachfrage nach Mobilität und so weiter. Jetzt wird sich ja die Frage stellen, dass die Benutzer, also diejenigen, die die zukünftige Dienstleistung in Anspruch nehmen, Mobility-Dienstleistung, ja im Grunde genommen durch einen zentralen Faktor getrieben sind, nämlich Kosten, Preis. Wo siehst du denn den Minimalpreis pro Kilometer pro Person oder pro Tag pro Person sozusagen als unterste Grenze in der Zukunft, sagen wir mal in den nächsten 10 Jahren sich hin entwickeln, sodass man so viele Leute wie möglich mitnehmen kann?
Hans-Günther, I've absorbed your question. I can answer it in German or in English. I think that we have some of the audience in English, but I'll paraphrase the. That's fine. I'll paraphrase and answer the question in English if you don't mind. Essentially, the question is cost the main driving force on a change in behavior from owning a private vehicle to using mobility as a service? And if it is indeed, what is the maximum or minimum cost of a kilometer? I would suggest that it's one of a number of factors. So today you may decide to go for the most economical mode of transport. Tomorrow you might go for the fastest one, and the other day you might choose the most comfortable one. I can speak from my experience in London that the fastest mode of transport in almost all cases is not the car. So I would choose even car sharing only if I want to get there comfortably, but certainly not quickly. If I wanted to get somewhere within 2 to 3 miles, the quickest way is most certainly a bicycle. If I wanted to get it in the most economical way, it'll be the bicycle or public transport, certainly cheaper than either using a public car or car sharing. So it depends very much on the city. There is a interesting phenomenon now that we're going to see in a post-pandemic world. So a lot of our transport and traffic is based on the premise of, let's say, 9 to 5 jobs, 5 days a week. So we have built infrastructure around a peak capacity somewhere between 8 and 9 a.m. and a peak capacity somewhere between 5 and 6 p.m. That is true for public transport, but it's also true of our roads. And that's 5 days a week. Now, what if we actually do come back to a hybrid world, certainly for service and non-manual labor jobs? We come back to a hybrid world where we're working 2 days a week from the office. And maybe we're not any longer tied to 9 to 5. Maybe we prefer to go from 8 to 4. Maybe we're only going into the office because the office is a place of collaboration and not a place of production. It doesn't make sense to go into an office to stare at a computer screen all day, does it? So we are going to change our interpretation of what an office is into a place of collaboration. So I might go to the office to attend 2 or 3 meetings, to do a workshop, to have a brainstorming session, and then I'll go back home. So my travel pattern will have changed. My travel pattern is not any longer driving in at 8 o'clock in the morning and driving back home at 5 o'clock in the evening. And if I'm only doing that 2 days a week, the 20,000 miles that I used to do with my car every single year gets reduced. Maybe I'm only driving 6, 7, 8,000 kilometers. And at that point, having and maintaining a private car is no longer the sensible and economic choice. I can tell you from my own personal experience in London, at some point, after 2 years of owning a car in London, I looked at the odometer and I looked at the cost that I had had with it over the course of 2 years. And I realized I was paying about £1 a mile to have a pile of steel parked in front of my apartment block. Right. And I can do a lot of taxis and I can do a lot of public transport and I can do a lot of biking for £1 a mile. So maybe that's not your experience. Maybe if you're driving a more economical car in a more economical city, maybe it's 50 euro cent per mile or per kilometer. But again, that's assuming that you're still driving 10,000, 20,000 miles. But because our behavior will change, our need for a vehicle will change as well. We have seen an incredible rise in the number of companies that will deliver things to you over the course of the pandemic. So if you think about the reasons you even have a car, it's to, bring your kids to football and to go to the grocery store and to go to work. Now take away the work part and you get your food and groceries delivered. Really, the only reason you still need a car is to bring your kids to football. Frankly, that's the only thing I ever use a car sharing vehicle for. So, and for that, I'm very, very happy to pay, whether it's 50 or 60 or 70 cents, but I'm doing a lot less of it than I ever did before. I hope that answers the question. It's not a clear cut answer, but it tells you that the demand can go down in a post-pandemic world.
It was a good answer. If I may just add one additional small picture to it. When you look at the exhaust, the production of CO2 in Germany, it's about of all CO2, 26.6% last year was the amount of CO2 production by traffic in Germany. Mm-hmm. When you take the scenario, especially the one that you just described a little bit further when we were looking at the economics picture, where would you see that leveling off, let's say, in 5 years? Or to what would you think it would drop down in 5 years and in 10 years? Would it drop down to 10% by 2030 or less? Or what?
Well, we do have a couple of converging trends, as we said. One of them is, of course, a different user behavior, and the other is the very, very rapid increase in new vehicle sales that are going into the electrified side. Now, remember that new vehicle sales is not the Fuhrpark. That's not the total number of vehicles on the street. It'll still take about 5 or 10 years before we replace that entirely, because or even get to that level, simply because people hold on to their cars. There are still a few people buying a diesel or a petrol car today who will probably still have the car 5 or 6 years from now before they finally recognize the error of their ways. So, being a little cheeky here, but so it does take us a little while. The pandemic has increased actually the sale of personal cars in a spike in a couple of countries, because people are less comfortable with public transport. But I see that as a very, very temporary blip, to be honest. Also because we have more alternatives, such as micromobility. And with that, by the way, I can really only encourage anyone who hasn't tried an e-bike. It is a true revelation. If you felt that you didn't enjoy biking before because you were going to get sweaty while wearing a suit, or it was unpleasant, or biking up the hill, or all of that, it frankly goes away with an e-bike. It really is quite impressive.
Thanks, Lukas.
Diego made a very, very good point with regard to telemedicine in the context of other reasons that we use a car to drive to doctors, to drive to medical care of any sort. And in fact, yes, telemedicine, I don't know who has had this experience also during the pandemic, has certainly taken off. I recently had a call with a highly qualified doctor together with my son when he had a sports injury, and it was all via a video call, and that took yet again another ride off the street.
Thanks, Lukas. Any more questions from the audience? I know Delois had a question, or otherwise I have like lots of questions from the registrants. Delois, do you want to say your one?
Well, yeah, I think I've got it now.
Sorry.
And you're right. You've already mentioned this in part, the differences between Germany and the States and Great Britain, but how is the overall reception of your ideas, your books, your whatever? Can you make any comparisons today, how they have been received in the 3 different countries?
Absolutely, and I can actually expand a little bit beyond that, because I've had the pleasure of sharing my thoughts, frankly, all over the world. And if I bring it down to the three key elements: electrification, autonomous, and changes in behavior such as sharing. Electrification obviously is hugely embraced, and if I go to the Scandinavian countries, they look at me like, yes, so we knew about that 5 or 10 years ago. You're not telling us anything new. Whereas I can, in the US, still very much tell the story of electrification because you still have a much smaller proportion of vehicles that are electrified. I think the big breakthrough in the US is when the #1 selling vehicle for the last 30 years in the US is now finally released as an electric vehicle. So that vehicle is the Ford F-150. As I said, over the last 30 years, the best-selling vehicle in the US, which is now being coming out as both a hybrid and a fully electric vehicle. So that means the electrification has a very big span between Scandinavian countries and the US. Germany is somewhere in between, let's say. I think there's been a great deal of pride and passion for the engineering around internal combustion engines, which has taken a while to overcome. And it's taken a while as well to develop pride and passion for the engineering around batteries and electric vehicles. It will come. I'm confident of that. It means a few less mechanical engineers and a few more electrical engineers. So Cornell, take note. And in Britain, there's a lot of passion, on the other hand, for autonomous. The British government is very intent on turning the UK into a leader for autonomous. In fact, the Queen herself has spoken about autonomous vehicles, which prompted the press to say it's the only country where the Queen can roll in on a horse-drawn carriage and talk about autonomous vehicles in her speech. Quite a nice spagat disparity there. So we have some leadership in autonomous, certainly in the US and in the UK. And also particularly in China. I didn't show the video today, but Baidu, in fact, is the first company who is running a paid autonomous taxi fleet in China. Waymo has been doing it as a pilot for some period of time, but Baidu is now actually taking money for it. As regards to sharing, now look, in Europe, the single largest city for car sharing is Berlin, by a long shot. Something like half of the sharing vehicles in Germany are actually in the car sharing vehicles are in Berlin, and there are a lot of different options. Ride hailing, very different picture. There are certain regulations that mean that the likes of Uber are less welcome in Germany than they are in places like the UK, where we have something like 70,000 or 80,000 private hire drivers. Primarily for Uber, Bolt, Lyft, Ola, and others. So you have a very mixed picture on what's being embraced where. On the other hand, micromobility, just to complete the picture, here in the UK, we still only have pilots of scooters. I'm not allowed to drive an e-scooter in London, legally anyway. Whereas in Paris, you can't walk 2 meters without stumbling over an e-scooter on the sidewalk or the pavement.
So Lukas, thanks. One further question on this. You talk a lot about the electrification or electric vehicles. That's at least the way I understood it. In Germany, you have a lot of criticism here and there towards the lithium ion. I mean, most electric vehicles are lithium ion vehicles, or maybe all of them. towards where does this source come from, where is it sourced, what are the supply chains here, what are the working conditions for these people, what is the CO2 overall picture to build a car in the electrification. Can you say something around that also with regard to the raw materials side? Is there enough lithium-ion to really have everybody drive around in electric vehicles? And if you also read, sorry for being with it longer, if you read sort of the people that, and I personally, we spoke about it earlier, I still drive one of these old diesel engines that you say
it's okay for
drive, but I have an old.
I know your next car will be electric.
My one, I drive a 20-plus-year-old car, so it's really old anyway. But you know, is it possible that we all drive electric, and is it possible that we all have the ability to really go 400 kilometers as we can do nowadays?
So the first question is, Volkmar, just because you can do 400 or 500 kilometers, how often does that actually happen? Most people actually don't. Very few people do. Even your taxi or Uber driver, if you ask them how many miles that they do on an average day, they certainly in London are somewhere around 60 to 80 miles. And the maximum that they might ever reach is 200 miles or around 320 kilometers. And virtually all of the new vehicles that are being launched, not just from Tesla, but in fact, Volkswagen ID3, ID4, etc., are all in the 400 kilometers and up range. Again, the question is, do you actually need that amount of range? Because most people genuinely don't. The second question is, if you do have an incident where you do need it, are you able to charge it up quickly in the time that you take a break or where you have a cup of coffee? That is increasingly so. Getting an 80% charge in most new vehicles, most new electric vehicles, takes about half an hour. So that's a good time to take a bio break and a caffeine break as well. Now, on your question about lithium, the simple fact is that we haven't looked very hard for lithium in the past because we haven't needed to. There hasn't been a huge demand for lithium, so lithium has been a Abfallprodukt. You know, it's been a byproduct of other types of mining, which is why it's been primarily in Argentina and in Australia and other places, but also in Africa, where perhaps the conditions haven't been great. Now, one of the largest reserves of lithium was recently found in the Rhine-Ruhr area, with a suggestion that lithium would be sufficient for something like 500, 600, 700,000 EVs easily. So we have the opportunity now to source lithium much closer to where it's being produced, which for me is very appealing because we also invest a lot of energy in getting stuff from A to B. The whole logistics of moving lithium ion all around the world, having batteries produced in one place, batteries produced in the other. If we actually mine, develop, build, produce, and use everything closer to the same place in Europe, that would be a real win, a breakthrough for me, because that further reduces the energy used by transportation.
Thanks. I see Delois raised her hand. Maybe one thing before Delois poses her questions. One comes here on the chat is regarding hydrogen. I think you mentioned it also in your presentation, and the common view, at least that I hear, is sort of lithium ion and electrification for cars and hydrogen for trucks. Is that also your view or different?
So, Volkmar, I worked at BMW in the late 90s, and I was involved in a hydrogen personal car project, the H7 at the time. And I was told by the engineers, it's only a matter of 10 years until there'll be hydrogen filling stations everywhere, and hydrogen will be the dominant method of energy storage. Let's be clear, a hydrogen electric vehicle and a battery electric vehicle are both electric vehicles. The actual motor is the same. It's just a question of how you store the energy. so in the late 90s, they told me it was just 10 years. In the 2000s, it's just another 10 years. In the 2010s, just another 10 years. And today, all of the hydrogen community is still saying it's another 10 years until hydrogen will have its big breakthrough moment. And the reality is it won't, not for personal cars and progressively not for other vehicles as well. And let me actually share a few backup slides that I have just exactly for this question. The simple fact is that it is inefficient. It is as inefficient as using an internal combustion engine, because between the point where the energy is produced and where the energy is used, in other words, where the wheels turn the vehicle on the streets, you're losing about 60 to 70% of the energy with hydrogen, because the energy needs to be through electrolysis, compressed, built, and it needs to be transported. There's a fuel cell that's being moved around. That fuel cell then converts again, and that's your e-engine. And in an e-car, you have the energy that's produced, it's stored, and it's used, and you have an efficiency rate of somewhere between 70 and 90%. Compare that to the best internal combustion engines, which were somewhere around 25 to 30%. This has led Volkswagen to come to the following conclusion. In the case of the passenger car, everything speaks in favor of the battery and practically nothing speaks in favor of hydrogen. Let's talk about other modes that you suggested, trains, trucks, and things like that. The same thing applies. You have the same situation that you have a well-to-wheel efficiency that is simply lacking for hydrogen. So you have a company like Scania who says, well, hey, guess what? We're going to stop developing the fuel cell and focus on full electric. And they think that they're going to be able to have that 40-ton vehicle drive 4.5 hours and then fully recharge using a battery electric during the driver's compulsory 45-minute rest. And you're getting the orders already from the logistics companies, those companies that are actually in the business of buying and operating those fleets of vehicles. So I think the window of opportunity is very much closing for hydrogen. I'm not particularly optimistic on that.
That's great, very interesting. I mean, just because my personal profession is also not as specifically towards mobility, but in the cleantech world, I recently was joining a conference called H2. I don't know if you also were part of that or participated in that. And there was a gentleman from Toyota, and Toyota is one of the companies who are actually producing hydrogen cars. The model is called Mirai, and the gentleman presented it and said that they were very optimistic to get costs down. Now the current costs were something in the range of 63,000 euro. Now that is probably not the average car that a typical German would drive. Anyway, but interesting.
I think they've sold 5,000 Mirai in the last 5 years or something. Yeah, I've actually driven the Mirai, and it's a nice car, but it's not a breakthrough car. And listen, if we have manufacturers developing and bringing to the streets some 200, 300, 400 different models of battery electric vehicles, and then you have Toyota and Hyundai as the only manufacturers of note, frankly, maybe Honda as well, building 1 or 2 fuel cell vehicles, it simply won't pass muster. The reason that they're doing it is because it's quite unique. Japan and South Korea are the only countries really that have any notable hydrogen filling infrastructure, and that's why a lot of what they're doing is building it for the home market.
Okay, Delois, you had a question?
I noticed that several people wanted to ask something and hadn't put their hand up, but now I see everybody's in the chat. So there are about 4.
There are a couple of great questions in the chat. I'm happy to take those. Hans
Kialka.
Do you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I'm not weird. Okay, well, thank you very much for this really excellent presentation, Lukas. It's fascinating, and we are certainly in the middle of very rapidly changing times. I recall you quoted Toyota. I recall I'm happy to be on the board of first-tier supplier still, where there's obviously some some hesitation about these aspects, and where obviously change needs to happen, of course. I recall a study of Toyota still in the early, I think 2005 or so, where Toyota announced that in the year 2050, there will only be 7.5% non-combustion cars on the road. So that shows how the time is changing. Obviously, one of the main drivers is obviously the aspect of climate change, and we realize that, and I would say that at least there's two aspects where there's some camouflage still involved. One aspect, for example, you showed the cars on the German roads with the hybrid cars. Well, as long as people don't unfold their cables for the hybrid cars and don't know how to plug in their cars, there's obviously not much change happening, and I think that's proven. They are highly supported from a financial point of view, but if and as long as people only use the fuel rather than the electric battery, then there's not much change. And obviously also electricity is only as good as the electricity where it comes from. Well, it obviously comes from the pocket, but we need to look a bit beyond that and see where the electricity is actually done and made. I don't want to dwell on that, but to what extent, and now coming to my question, do you think all these changes will happen more or less driven by the economy, by the purse of the individual, or do you think we will need the regulator more extensively than it happened in the past? Number one. Number two, to what extent are we not dependent also on international arrangements? I think something like the Biden Biden administration now going back on the Paris Accord and things like that. That's obviously highly desirable change. But to what extent do you think this will go through the purse or through the need to have the regulator actually get involved and more extensively involved than it has been in the past?
Okay. So I think a lot of decisions are being made right now at the very local level. Cities are perhaps even greater drivers, certainly of sharing and electrification than the national level at the moment. And the examples that I shared, Paris, Brussels, by the way, very similarly, is doing a lot of pedestrianization, wants to be the biggest pedestrian area in Europe. Is being done at city level. And that's simply because there's still a lot of, how shall I say this delicately, disagreement at national and international levels at how far we should push the boat out. Now that's certainly changing, and it's nice and welcome that that Biden is setting a good example. The entire US fleet of government vehicles will be electric or electrified going forward. So that not just sets an example, but it also gives important critical mass to manufacturers who need that going forward. But let's face it, every mode of transport has been, even historically, subsidized. The oil industry is heavily subsidized and has been subsidized for a very, very, very long time. And that what that does, it creates certain incentives that allow us to cheaply own and operate a car, relatively speaking. Now, some of those subsidies can very well be shifted now to other things. Obviously, public transport has people have said, hey, well, public transport never needs to make money. How are they supposed to, how they're not profitable? It's a little bit different in the UK, by the way. Transport for London is required to actually break even, which is very different than in many European countries. But this all comes down to an economic principle called nudge economics, right? The packet of incentives and disincentives that you create, whether that's regulatory, whether that's subsidies, or whether it's infrastructural, moves people in a certain direction. And for 120 years, we've moved people into the direction of car ownership. And now we need to veer into the other direction and gently nudge people into the direction of shared use, because it's simply unsustainable. So it's not any single lever that we can kind of flip the switch. It is a packet of different incentives, disincentives, and subsidies and the like. I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Volkmar, der Hans Kjalka, der hat schon ein paar Mal versucht, die Hand zu heben und
oh, sorry, please.
zu werden.
Then he should speak up. Hans, please speak up.
I have a big question. You said that we should be able that in 15 minutes range to get everything we need. That is all transported by trucks. Where are trucks in your model?
Well, trucks are electrified, no question about that. The last mile, as I've shown, can be autonomous. It can be in various sizes as well. I think we have Germany and the UK among leading countries in the world when it comes to delivery, by the way. Not just long distance logistics companies like DHL, DPD and things like that, but also on what's called the last mile. And some of that is done by big heavy trucks, and a lot of it is progressively or increasingly being done by smaller vehicles and even cargo bikes. So
I'm not speaking about the last mile. The last mile you showed even a roboter, but that roboter got out of one place where all the things that they delivered were brought by a truck. And on your roads, I didn't see a truck.
Now, you will actually in London see very, very, very few trucks. You will not see virtually any vehicles higher than larger than, let's say, a 7.5 ton in the streets of London. Because what you have is redistribution centers at the outskirts of cities that take the volume of a large truck and put it into smaller trucks. And in mega cities, I think that's increasingly so. Even if you consider large construction sites in the middle of the city, where they are more likely to be served by two smaller vehicles than one large vehicle. Now you can question the economics or the feasibility of it, but the simple fact is the infrastructure doesn't support large trucks in a place like London, just as it doesn't. Just as the infrastructure in Venice doesn't support large trucks, or the infrastructure in other old Italian cities wouldn't allow a large truck. So when we talk about trucks, we need to be clear: are we talking 40 ton, 12 ton, 7.5 ton, or a 2.5 ton van? So I think we will see a variety of different sizes, all electrified. And it'll be very, very much dependent on the city that they operate in.
You answered correctly. London went to little trucks or little vans. You increased traffic. In your book, you just said you want to decrease traffic. So one large truck going into a city is better than 10 little vans.
If the infrastructure doesn't support, I mean, there's simply no place to park a very large, long, 40 ton truck in most places in a city like London. Now that, again, it may be very different, and you occasionally see them driving down the street in Munich, but even there, it's a real rarity to see a 40 ton driving down Leopoldstraße. So you know, needs must where. Yeah. Now, true. Yes, supermarkets need to be delivered to, but here again, we're at the delivery of groceries phase now too.
Okay, that's true. I missed a little bit the other logistics of parts being delivered to manufacturing companies, food being delivered to restaurants, clothing being delivered to city malls, and that's only comment that the traffic will continue to be on some kind of transportation. Can you have some ideas of the things that can be during the day delivering parts, can be in the evening collecting garbage, but there is still another flow of materials and goods in the city than just people.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and I count on the creativity. I count on the creativity of logistics, who, by the way, has an incredible leadership role in this space. Experiments and pilot programs, whether it's UPS or DHL, who have you know, adopted the use of cargo bikes for smaller packages. You know, where you have a large, perhaps you have a large UPS truck, which then actually is redistributed into 5 or 6 cargo bikes, and so you only have one of those driving around. That same van would otherwise have been driving around. Now it's parked somewhere, and it shifts to a cargo bike. I count on them to use only the size vehicle that they actually need. So there is a certain downsizing trend as well. Will frequency increase? Yes, it could very well be that frequency increases. There's a lovely museum here in London, the London Transport Museum, where if you go to their annex, which has lots and lots of different vehicles from the past, there's actually, London used to use the tube network to bring groceries into the city. In fact, there's a train where the milk, a train which had a special suspension system so that the milk didn't go sour as it was coming from the outskirts of London and being brought in using the tube network into the center of London. It's frankly a shame that we don't use that anymore, but the same principles could still apply, that we actually have new networks for dedicated logistics infrastructure.
So many thanks, Lukas. That's I think a lot of questions here. I think we would like to move into the sort of social part, and I know Lukas has already his wine glass next to him. Exactly, very nicely. Is there a last, maybe if somebody has an urgent question, last question, we can still do that. Otherwise, if anybody wants to raise his or her hand.
Well, the sea level still are going to rise further, then the Venice concept might be applicable in a couple other places as well, like Hamburg and Hong Kong and whatever. That's a slightly facetious remark here, obviously, but then Venice will no longer be around.
I think if I heard it right, Wolfgang, you were talking about sea level rise. Is that correct?
Yeah. A slightly facetious comment, yes, about sea level, and that then if they continue to rise, that then we have the same concept of it's so beautiful in Venice. We'll have it in Hamburg and Hong Kong and other places as well.
A lot of cities are very much at risk of that. In fact, it boggles my mind that people are still buying properties in Miami Beach, but there we go. But the issue isn't so much Miami Beach. The issue is much more around places like Bangladesh and other places in Indonesia, of course, as well, moving its capital. Pretty significant things that we'll see, and cities are bearing the brunt of that. So if we thought that pandemics were a test to the resilience of a city, as they were, and that clearly is the case, I think a lot of cities still have a major test in front of them.
Good. So then I would, with that, I would like to also see many thanks here coming in. So also thanks to the audience, obviously.